how did we get into the crisis that we're currently facing in society, especially in regards to how we think? Ever since the 1600s, modern philosophers have shaped how we think about life, about the important issues that we face day to day. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Conor Sweeney, a professor of theology at Christendom College, who's going to give us a deeper insight into understanding how modern philosophy has shaped how we think today and how we can get back to a more sane way of thinking, a more godly way of understanding and appreciating life.
One of the questions we face today is one of meaning. Is there a deep meaning to reality, or is reality just on the surface? And when we look at our world today, we speak of our modern world, which tends to be very secular in terms of how we understand things. So how do we get to a point in the West where, as Nietzsche expressed it, God is dead? Somehow meaning, transcendent meaning, religious meaning, in many respects no longer seems to be part of the fabric of our existence. We believe in many things, he thinks, but we don't actually believe in God. You can look at Christianity and say, well, we failed in many respects in regard to embodying the gospel truths. Part of that failure resulted in the so-called wars of religion, the splintering of the whole Christendom project. And when you consider the ideas of the Enlightenment, freedom is so important here. The idea of freedom as liberation, the idea of a self who no longer needs to live under the shadow of tradition and authority. And so once that idea takes root, it tends to take root at a very deep level. I need to define myself in order to realize myself. It's like when you're young, growing up in your family, your parents are telling you what to do and what not to do. That can be seen as very restrictive if you are no longer able to perceive the truth of what they are trying to articulate to you. What does it mean to say that the human person is not just bodily, but also a spiritual being? Today, we tend to look at the surfaces of things, or if we say there's an inside to a surface, it's always going to be a purely material, biological, physical explanation for it. Now, the idea of the human person as a body-soul composite, soul, spirit expressing itself as a body, this vital spiritual principle in man. This is something that is very strong, obviously, in the Christian tradition as one of the key central tenets of our belief in terms of what we call anthropology. Who is the human person? If we look at a human body, the idea there is, well, this body in and of itself cannot explain itself. You have to adduce some higher principle. So Plato, Aristotle, each in their own way, they would have understood there to be a higher spiritual principle that lies behind and is the animating principle of what we call matter, materiality. We understand the human being to be a rational soul. The body, therefore, as Pope John Paul II put it so evocatively, expresses the person. When you see the body, you see that person in their full spiritual capacity. Now, if you believe in God, if you believe in spirit on principle, then this is not going to be too big of an ask. When you bracket out God, when you bracket out spirit, maybe if we say first that God is a deistic principle, a watchmaker God who creates and then sort of sits back and lets us do our own thing, well, maybe that will sustain the idea that there is a spiritual reality for a time. But it's a very short jump from that to then say, well, in practical terms, all there is matter. Now, once you make that shift, it's then very easy to start viewing the human body, the human person, as merely a material being. We no longer look for higher meaning. We no longer see something like love, let's say, as an objective, real reality. We no longer think of experience as including the experience of transcendence. So when you look at a sunset, for example, we no longer see transcendent beauty. We no longer see a path to the divine. Rather, we tend to see merely light in ways that you might describe light scientifically. If God is dead, if there is no more vital spiritual principle, then all we really are bodies. That would be the key point to articulate here. And if we are again to see ourselves as body-soul composite, in which the body expresses the person, then some deeper framework, some deeper encounter with transcendence is going to be needed. Do I have free will? That's a very good question in regards to what it means to be human. If there's a God, and if God is infinite freedom, how can I possibly have freedom as a finite creature? God has created me. God is my one ultimate end, as St. Thomas would have expressed it. So that end, God's infinite goodness, God's love, that is actually what my freedom has been created for. So my freedom is falsified when I think of it in terms of me doing whatever I want. So God has given me freedom. It's real freedom because it allows a creature who is not God to make a free response to the divine initiative. If freedom is oriented to the good, then an act against that good is the precise opposite of freedom, i.e., slavery. What is virtue? How does virtue relate to the moral life? It has something to do with the way in which I have been created with this capacity for God. And so I realize myself, therefore, by particular acts. And these particular acts either actualize my existence as created by and for God, or they take me somewhere far away from the fullness of my existence. And so in this sense, morality, action, virtue, these are paths towards the good life, towards happiness. Happiness being union with God, something that I recognize as connatural to me. If I bear a nature that is ordered to God, then to fail to realize this nature, to act in ways contrary to it, are going to be problematic and aren't actually going to lead me to happiness. So the question of truth, the truth towards which my action tend, that becomes very, very critical at the point in which all of our freedoms, our individual freedoms, start to contest and power starts to win the day. Why bother getting out of bed in the morning if all life is a brief little blip of life followed by eternal death, the void, nothing? That's a permanent, pressing, existential question for us today. And is there an answer? Well, the answer of Christianity, and to some extent the answer of the preceding Greek tradition, Aristotle, would say, well, no, there is actually a determinate end, or telos meaning end in Greek, to which the human person is ordered. And this end, says Aristotle, is commensurate with my nature, and if I follow this end, if I realize this end, I will be happy. One of the key ideas of the Enlightenment is that the individual is king. The individual is sovereign and autonomous. Now, the Christian idea of the individual, the self, the person, is in many respects diametrically opposed to the modern secular one. To be an individual, to be a person, is always to come from another. It is to be from the other, from God, if we're speaking in terms of creation. In human terms, it is to be from a mother and father. And the extent to which I try to emancipate myself from relation per se is the extent to which I fundamentally distort the understanding of myself as a being created for love and communion. And so somehow rehabilitating the fullness of love, the fullness of relation in light of, again, the Son who becomes incarnate as the other that fulfills me to my very core. How do we foster an experience of the church, of faith, that again recaptures the novelty and the depth of this encounter? That, I would say, is the evangelical task for us today.
That's definitely inspiring, understanding how we got to where we are, what the problems are, and how to face them fundamentally, how to reorder our lives, especially in regards to forming relationships, realizing that we come from a mother and a father, that we come from God as creatures to be in relation to others, to love, and to get back to a better way of thinking, to live a life of joy, fulfillment, peace, and communion. This is what we can bring to a world that is hurting because of modern philosophy. It's up to us to make a difference.